Hi, welcome back to this kind of random podcast where it's just topic that gets the interest gets my interest most. I am joined by a very special guest today, Fiona Apollo. How you doing today, Fiona?
Doing very well. Thanks for having me over.
Yeah. Would you mind introducing yourself really quick, just so the people can know your work?
Sure thing. My name's Fionapollo. I'm primarily a YouTube content creator, but I am also an indie creator. I do animations on the side. I'm an artist. I mostly talk about things like pop culture. I talk about the animation industry because I was originally going to try to get into it, but then COVID happened. And since then, I've kind of tried to be an advocate for better working conditions in the industry, and I've tried to support other indie projects as best as I can. It's tough work because I still work full time as well with a normal job, but I do what I can.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. As people on this channel do get, it's just yeah, animation takes a lot of work.
It really does. It's crazy.
Okay, yeah. But today we're talking about something kind of near and dear to my heart that has kind of like this subgenre, I suppose is the best way to describe it, of Greek myth retellings and adaptations and how they have kind of uh the very popular rise, but also kind of the issue some of them are presenting. Because I feel like as of recent, we might have hit the glass ceiling with these of people starting to kind of push back or be a lot more critical of Greek myth retellings and how mythology is used in general in pop culture.
Yeah, I completely get that. A lot of people are kind of seeing the Greek retellings in particular as kind of a projection onto a legitimate culture, Greek culture per se, and Greek history. And I think a few people are taking issue with it because it kind of comes across like almost like a Western takeover in a sense, similar to how certain cultures, say for example, a lot of English culture now is very erased. Like the pre-Christian kind of English culture is not as well known anymore as to what went on and what kind of stories were told, what kind of gods there were. And I think a lot of people are getting worried about that because it's also kind of approaching that way where things are getting retold and reappropriated and bastardized in a sense.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to get very much into that, but before we do, I have to get into a very gross oversimplification of both Greek mythology and Greek culture and how we kind of got here. Okay, so uh, Mediterranean Sea, what we now know as the Greek Isles, were filled up by a bunch of various tribes, uh, and a lot of them, you know, a lot of them had philosophers and poets who would have what we know as Greek myths, and a lot of these stories were very much told orally, especially ones featuring the gods themselves. Only a handful of stories were written down, and through both trade, colonization, and like other invasions with countries, these stories did get these stories were traveled across the world and across the globe, and kind of got even back then were reinterpreted like well before anything such as like the internet was a thing. But after, very notably, there was reinterpretations and like plays by a lot of Roman poets who had their own influence, and then they had their own. Then afterwards, the very big boom, which became a bit more of a cultural norm, was Shakespeare, who did and like other English plays that did also reinterpret a lot of Greek plays into uh, their culture and trying to sometimes update it, sometimes mistranslate it. And then, as time went by, when Greek mythology became a bit more well known, a bit more taught in class to class, like among at least in the Western area, uh, it became something people would have a more basis knowledge commonly than say an Asian culture because America and the UK and a lot of other Western countries did kind of mull themselves off Greece to a degree ish, which is I think it's important to say of like kind of it's Western, but there's a very big cultural and historic difference. And then we had stuff like the rise of, very notably in the 60s and God, to the 90s, I'd say, we had a very prominent rise of movies that were reinterpreting or trying to adapt Greek myth stories or condensing them. But now we have something a bit more interesting. We have a new trend. Oh yeah, also in the early 2000s, we had Red Pill Alpha Bro Greek myth retellings, which is the best way to describe
Mm.
manly man, just and no same-sex relationships in those movies. But yeah, the whole 300 thing, all that kind of work, but which has been super heavily criticized, rightfully so to a degree. Uh, but now we have an interesting, I don't think something we can really correlate it to with how Greek myth retellings are done now, because now we have Greek myth retellings that are marketed as feminist retellings or queer retellings. A lot of them are approached in the way of they use retelling as a marketing strategy to a degree, and a lot of them, are a lot more open of saying this is a queer myth retelling, this is a feminist myth retelling, and we kind of want to discuss some of the impact that might have on both how we talk about Greek mythology and culture as a whole, but also what's like does it like really succeed at that? Fiona, what's your experience with like your average Greek myth retelling or adaptation?
So, with me, something I have noticed a lot, and it's mostly in books I've noticed, because I actually own a copy of A Song of Achilles. It's actually my
Mm.
partner who's a massive Greek myth, like, buff, more so than I am. I just kind of tell them about different adaptations that are getting popular at the moment, like the epic musical. They listen to it and they're like, this, and it is
Yeah,
inaccurate.
I'm a very, very big a fan of Epic the Musical, but there's that part of that in my brain. It's just
Yeah. And I think what the perspective I have with it is that it's very much kind of a fandom thing.
mm,
Like, what I've noticed is that a lot of people, and it's a lot of neurodivergent people, a lot of people with kind of a very keen interest in something like Greek myth, for example, they become very interested in it and they kind of think about it and they kind of invest a lot of time and energy into their own interpretations of it. And sometimes that evolves in the form of these retellings. A lot of the time, it can happen in fan fiction, especially. And I
mm,
think that also bleeds into public perception of how they view these certain myths, especially considering that fandom spaces as well, they're very queer focused, they're very queer forward, and I think that influences a lot of people's perceptions on certain relationships as well within certain characters, say, for example, Achilles and Patroclus. So
yeah.
I think from that perspective, that's kind of where I understand what, that's kind of where I think that's how I see things happening at the moment, essentially.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting area where we're at because yes, people have always been people to a degree, but and it is good that people are a bit more publicly acknowledging that same-sex relationships, especially between men, were a lot more common in Greek myth than you would
Mm.
expect. Uh, Heracles got down, but yeah, he described as an innumerable amount of male lovers, which is like that's a lot, but but now it's almost like we've kind of it feels less like it's a Greek myth retelling in the way of showing uh what it's like through like an ancient society or people's interest in history so much. And it's almost making it so it can be updated for like a modern audience. I don't want to like be a bit too not judging people to a degree, but I mean, you and I are both queer writers, and we're just clearly and that has always like got our interest, but it feels like it's almost there for like the Steven Universe fandom, if that makes sense. Like that's kind of my issue with Son of Achilles, where Patroclus and Achilles uh, are characters who would feel like they would fit very much so in something uh, like the Dragon Prince or Steven Universe with a very modern sense of humor, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think it's important to note of like yes, while there are areas of Greek history and Greek culture that has like greatly varies the story, archaic, Hellenistic, classical, all that stuff, and a very common kind of defense I have seen is well, Greek myth retellings. I mean, Greek mythology isn't even canon to Greek mythology. That's only somewhat true. Well, yes, it is very tough to have get the exact story because most of these stories were told orally, and we only have a fraction of a lot of Greek mythology that was written down. We can, however, usually detect which stories are the oldest, and it's the closest you can say to being canon, which I think gets ignored a lot because classicist is like a degree, and like people spend their whole like professional careers researching mythology and like because when you research mythology, you also have to research the culture and the history and the circumstances of the time, and a lot of that feels kind of like dipped out for people just kind of like seeing the most surface level aspects of mythology.
Yeah, like I think a lot of people tend to not realize that there are certain sensibilities that don't translate across eras.
Hmm.
For example, I think with the situation that Penelope is in the Odyssey, for example, a lot of people seem to think that the suitors were intruding and kind of forcing themselves to be there, and she wasn't able to stand her ground as well. But the issue with that is that, and this is stuff that my partner's told me, so I'm hoping it's correct. She couldn't turn them away
Yeah.
because in Greek culture back in that time, it was very rude to do so, and it was very dangerous because one of those people could be a god in disguise, and you could be punished for it.
Yeah, especially laws of Xenia is very important. Like Penelope can't really be a bad guess because that's also a political move. Uh,
Yeah.
that was another thing I found interesting when reading most versions of the Odyssey, especially I want to say Robert Fagles was the one I read of. The Odyssey is mostly a political drama, and a lot of that kind of gets stitched out for the more fantastical elements. Greek mythology has always had fantastical elements, but it is also meant as like a reflection of the time. Like these aren't just like fun, like weird events that happen for no reason. It's like there's usually a through line, and the Trojan War itself does start because essentially all the kings, the king queen kings, were able to come to an agreement with uh, the royalty of Troy, and then uh, Paris kidnaps Helen, but he did that while I guess in Menelaus' home, and also stole a bunch of treasure. So, which is considered a huge violation of Xenia. So,
Mm.
even though, funny enough, well, Zeus did give them permission to invade Troy. Zeus was more so a bit on the side of Troy and did not want to see them fall, but he had to stay neutral in the debate, mainly because he, like, well, for one, he was kind of the overseer god, but also Hera was involved in, and she wanted Troy to fall. And very interestingly, like, Zeus, like, I can't really, impede on my wife. Just, yeah, which is very kind of a fascinating detail, which gets left out a lot. I think another interesting thing, and we're going to bring it up a few times. Oh, by the way, just a full disclosure, we're probably going to pronounce some names differently than you pronounce them, listener at home, because that's another deal of like how you pronounce some of these names are very tricky. But uh, uh, Madeline Miller's Son of Achilles, I have read it. Uh, It's the only Madeline Miller book I have read. I don't think it's a bad book. I think it's fairly a bit flat, a bit generic. And I think a lot of this does have to do with the fact that she is adapting Achilles and Patroclus. Historically, uh, when Homer's poems were reinterpreted, were retold, there was kind of especially in like the more recent-ish eras, like the last few hundred years, there was a kind of a debate of if Achilles and Patroclus were lovers, despite most though scholars agreeing that they were, uh, with a lot of like 40s and 50s stuff, and even to like recently, I want to say the early 2000s, mainly had Achilles and Patroclus either be cousins or just like really good pals, just like just cool, just yeah, two cool dudes. But and Madeline Miller wanted to highlight the fact that they were lovers during the Trojan War, which I do think is admirable. However, Achilles and Patroclus are not the most likable characters to adapt, which I think is an issue she has because she writes Achilles and Patroclus as very reactionary, very nice, very kind, very intelligent, very like empathetic towards other people. When Achilles and Patroclus were not that, especially Achilles, who is described as the most terrified of men. Uh, I'm curious. Do you know how the Iliad opens?
Oh, it's been quite a while. I don't think I can remember it exactly.
Well, it opens with Achilles arguing with Agamemnon about
Mm.
a sex slave he wants. Just
Ah, yeah, that was it.
yeah,
Yeah, a
yeah,
lot of people tend to forget that these were military men. Like
yeah. Especially
they
in a
they had quite a bit of grit to them.
yeah in a very violent era as at the same time. And
Mm.
Achilles is, he's refers to the bane of men. He would, even before the era of Troy, he would ransack these cities and he would, pillage and kidnap women. Uh, yes, well, he did have a very important relationship with Patroclus, even referring to him as like his head. Or his heart, I believe, something along those lines, depending on your translation.
Mm.
Achilles does also have relationships with other women, which are, very important, but at the same time, it does kind of feel like Madeline Miller feels like you can't write a story with two leads who do things that are a bit unlikable to a degree, which I think is also another issue that comes with a lot of these retellings of you want to present these characters, but you also want to like maybe be like smooth over their edges a bit too much.
Yeah, I think another issue with that as well, especially when it comes to kind of queer retellings, especially, is that the queer community has a bit of a hang up when it comes to a queer character having too many negative traits, purely
Yes.
because we have been depicted so negatively over the span of history that veering too far into kind of that line can cause quite a significant backlash. And I think she was probably aware of that as well.
Oh yeah, of course. Are you familiar with the author Mary Renault?
Oh, I've heard the name, yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually a very big fan of her. I actually have her book, The King Must Die, right in front of me, and not exactly a one-to-one, but I think it's an interesting comparison between Mary Renault and Madeline Miller because Mary Renault also she wrote Greek retellings of Greek mythology, uh, similar to Madeline Miller. She wrote them mainly about Theseus. However, what's interesting about Mary Renault's books is despite the fact they're told almost historically, like these are events that potentially could have happened, uh, she doesn't really focus on making the characters that likable. They're or even relatable to a degree of like they're very fascinating, nuanced, just like they're characters who feel like they're from the ancient world, and I can see Madeline Miller trying to emulate that some parts, but not quite willing to like make the final step.
Mm.
I think it's also interesting because Mary Renault, uh, she was gay in the God, I want to say the 50s, uh, and she wrote these books while she was living with her partner. Uh, and of course, it was a very, very different time. But I think it's another interesting thing of like when we say words like gay or bisexual or queer, those are fairly recent developed terms. I believe only like 200 years back, which in the grand scheme of history is not that long.
Nah, it's really not at all. It was more so just kind of, I don't know. It was people tended to more run on vibes than labels, didn't they? And I mean,
Yeah.
the labels are very helpful, but I think it also kind of impedes on fluidity. I think once people decide that this is who I am, the label kind of prevents them from kind of inspecting it further, and instead they feel like they have to layer labels on top of each other instead of just I don't know, going with the flow, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah, no, totally. Speaking of going with the flow with like potentially, characters who are almost like who get kind of the reverse Achilles treatment of like being almost seen like a more I don't want to say I don't want to say intentionally Christianized, but almost like maybe subconsciously Christianized of characters like uh I think very infamously Hades or Ares or Zeus, who are seen as like, the bad, evil gods in a lot of pop culture right now. Maybe not so as much Hades, as he's had a very weird boom since 2010. Just where he went from being just the devil to like a weird Tumblr sexy man.
Yeah, it's a weird one, especially when you throw Christianity into it, because I don't know. I feel like Christianity just kind of threw a lot of things into turmoil and made so many more things more black and white than they are actually intended to be. It was a similar thing that happened kind of like with Celtic cultures like English, Irish, Welsh, Scottish. Uh, oh, this annoys me because I actually recently found this out. So it turns out that a lot of pagan issues that people have were actually ideas conceived by Julius Caesar.
Mhm.
Uh, yeah, and I think with the rise of like the Roman Empire and the imposition of Christianity, I think that places a lot of it places a lot of tricky connotations and roles onto characters and gods like Hades, and it casts them in a bit of a strange light because even with the devil, like even in Christian lore, with the devil, he's not really supposed to be you know absolutely horrible to every single person in hell. He's supposed to be kind of a judge. He's supposed to be impartial.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Another thing is that the Bible is also a collection of poems and notes and letters that have been acquired over like various years. And from also, this is another interesting thing of like when you're dealing with languages from another culture, it takes a lot of time to really properly decipher it, as opposed to like how the way it's shown in a lot of movies of like the archaeologists just like kind of running their hand over it and perfectly translating it. It's like, well, this could actually mean like five things, just
Yeah.
what we've gathered. But yeah, with also, it does feel like there's almost been a bit of an overcorrection to the degree of characters like Hades or Medusa or stuff like that, where people maybe find out a smaller myth about them, or maybe even like they might have heard of a retelling, and they almost use that as like their official canon. It's just like, no, this is the way it is. And I don't want to say they're a bit too set in their opinion, but I think they're kind of maybe unwilling to maybe be a bit more curious about maybe the actual historical like context of that story, or if their translation is very proper. Are you aware of the whole Medusa debacle now?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah, yeah. Where if for those of you who think Medusa was turned into a gorgon due to uh being assaulted by Poseidon, but usually by and she gets turned by Athena. That's mostly, but that is very much believed to be a later Roman addition, mainly by Ovid, mainly because he was questioning authority. However, when you do read the original, like there's no Greek version that has Medusa be transformed into a Gorgon. Medusa was always because she was a child of Echidna, uh,
Mm.
and she has this. A part of it may be due to the fact because she's a more is interesting seeing a female monster. You do want to have sympathy with her, but there's kind of been a level of like almost like overcorrection to the point where it's like if I'm not saying you can't like talk about the Rowan version, but if you do, there should be an acknowledgement of which version you're talking about, because if not, it may lead to people talk about Medusa in when they're trying to speak about like actual Greek mythology, they may be giving an inaccurate summary. Because I think that is another important thing we do have to realize of like, yes, these were actually cultures and religions that were worshipped and still are worshipped to a degree in parts of the world,
Yeah.
which I think people sometimes forget. Uh, but it's a difficult aspect, and you don't want to be like overly critical of some people, but it's kind of tough to say because it's kind of tough to deal with another Medusa retelling when characters like, I don't know, Donna or uh, Andromache are just kind of like thrown to the side. And Medusa, would you say Medusa's more popular than Perseus now?
That's pretty difficult to say because I think Medusa's popularity carries a lot of connotations with it.
Mhm.
Uh, I wouldn't say so, but at the same time, I don't want to confirm nor deny that because,
Okay.
yeah, it's not really my ballpark.
Oh no, yeah, totally. But yeah, and speaking of, Perseus, kind of a weird tangential thing is that it does. I can't help but notice kind of the correlation I see of modern, like, more adult retellings of Greek mythology, like give me Song of Achilles or Olympus or uh what's another one that's coming out? Sorry, I'm just trying to think of like more modern stuff. Comic books and stuff like that, like more
Hmm.
stuff like Absolute Wonder Woman. And I can't also help but notice of like the year, like a lot, how old some of these writers may be, and when Percy Jackson got very popular. I'm not here to, dismiss Percy Jackson. I think that is a great way to get kids into Greek mythology and into mythology in general.
Hmm.
But I think it's important to note that Percy Jackson is for kids. Like, it's not going to get into the darker aspects of Greek mythology. It's
Yeah.
allowed to be a bit more. It's kind of like it's kind of like why I'm a bit more okay with stuff like Disney's Hercules, because like it's a comedy movie basically. It's a sports movie. So it doesn't need to be, if it gets people into Greek mythology, that's great, but that should not be your main basis for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Excuse me. Uh, I think also another thing that is a bit tough for some people to understand is uh, gods in Greek mythology are not really people, which is, they're more so ideas or concept or themes of aspects of nature they represent. Because most gods in Greek mythology do represent a multitude amount you know, uh, of traits. Like Zeus is not just like, when people talk of Zeus, they either think like Sky Lightning Man or like weird wizard pervert now. But Zeus, he was also like he was the god of like he was a judge. He was a the god of the skies and nature, and he was also the god of like hospitality, which is why Zeus is very important to like immigrants. And there is the factor that you have to kind of handle of like, you are well, ancient Greek myth and ancient Greek society was very patriarchal. It is important to note that you are, to a degree, almost like oversimplifying the stories a bit more from back then, which I find to be kind of frustrating and not like it does kind of remind me a bit of what's the Disney remakes, the live action ones of making the princess who was like maybe criticized in the 2000s and like 2010s for maybe not being like the best modern feminist role model, into like kind of dismantling them entirely and just kind of giving them a 180 personality shift.
Yeah, like Belle.
Yeah, yeah, making them very pushy and just uh, yeah. I think it's also another thing I do find that kind of frustrating to bring up is that in a lot of these stories it does kind of feel like a lot of the smaller subtle like acts of political like maybe acts of like political movement, very much so like Penelope herself in the Odyssey, kind of gets pushed aside for the more fantastical elements, which I do get it, because on the surface level they are very fun. But the issue is that you are missing a very important character who is uh, very intelligent, very like very complicated, and it does seem like she gets kind of just she gets put as like the wife in a lot of these.
Yeah, especially when you consider the fact that there is speculation that she may also have been a Spartan princess, which is the reason she would have been able to know things such as stringing Odysseus's bow.
Yeah.
And yeah, with the whole patriarchal sense, yeah, I agree. Like, I think a lot of the fantastical elements that happen to the male characters are these things that kind of take the most precedence and have the most oomph to them in a sense that is what kind of takes priority, and the smaller, more nuanced situations or dynamics within characters, they kind of, yeah, they do kind of get brushed to the side a little bit.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. But one of the aspects also of the Odyssey is essentially Odysseus being like thrown between very powerful women like Circe and Calypso, or
Mm,
Turkey, if you want to say that. But a lot of people do, a lot of scholars do believe that this is also meant to kind of be a punishment reflection of what happened at Troy, mainly at the end of Troy, of how he, overthrew the city and what would have happened to a lot of those women. Because I think that's another important thing to note of people kind of taking like a lot of Greek myth wars and battles. It's like, oh, it's just a cool fantasy thing. It's like a lot of slavery was involved in that. Uh,
yeah.
which happened to a lot of Trojan women as well. And Odysseus is, in a way, very ultimately responsible for it because he did know how to break through the walls of Troy. Essentially, both the Iliad and the Odyssey are anti-war stories because everyone just comes out worse for it. But that very sad just kind of gets, I don't know, it gets weirdly forgotten because it's almost like when you want to try and update for modern audiences, you forget what the original intention was and how people have always been people to a degree, and people have always had these thoughts of like, hey, war is bad. Yes. But it's almost like, I don't know, almost like thinking people of the past were less complex than us.
Yeah, and that's a very kind of dangerous mindset to have because these people were just as, if not more complicated than we are now.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. I think, yeah, another thing is that when it comes to when you do discuss aspects of like certain kingdoms, like these characters would be from, stuff like that, and like the gods they would have worship, a lot of people have like kind of had like a weird, I don't know, just mostly surface level consumption of it, and when they hear something, like it's almost like a game of telephone to the degree where the Greek gods kind of like oh, I'm sorry, excuse me.
You're right.
Yeah, I'm fine. Just swallowed. I swallowed air wrong. I just yeah, Zeus saw me just like strike him down. But yeah, a lot of these. I think infamously something I have noticed a lot lately is a lot of people saying like Ares as Penelope's like patron god, which this is another interesting discussion because Ares was only like associated with Sparta in the very very later years of Greece and would not be Penelope's patron god. Sparta was mostly, I believe, it was Artemis, Apollo, and Hermes that Athena, like that people in Sparta would have worshipped more so than Ares, which
Yeah.
yeah, it just oh ooh. Uh, yeah.
I think Ares was a very specific god, wasn't he? Like, he was only really worshipped during times of extreme bloodshed.
Yeah, Ares and Hades are in an interesting place because, yes, while they were not predominantly worshipped, they were, however, like a part of it is also just because, like, it would almost just be dumb to worship that because it's like, well, you don't really worship, the fact you're gonna die or the fact that war is a thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think yeah, it does also kind of remind me of like, so I do see on like the internet now of like when people learn out a few things about Ares, it can remove the context of some of these stories of. I'm not sure if you've heard this trend of like people calling Ares the defender of women. It's very strange. It's a trend that's kind of overtake. I noticed this a lot more on TikTok, to be fair, but it does seem like it's almost like a retellful. Part of it is due to the fact there's two stories mainly. One where Ares does kill one of the sons of Poseidon who rapes his daughter. The other one is where Ares is described as the feasted on by women, uh, which those are do portray the nuances of the character, but at the same time, it does also erase a lot of the details of the story. Him When gods kind of interact with other gods, it's much less so just. I think that's the other thing. When people say, "Oh, it's just a giant soap opera," kind of, but it's also like there's elements of like territory and regions and domains that are very specific to gods.
Yeah.
Which I think a lot of people forget. That was actually the main reason why Hera was so mad at Heracles, which gets very much lost over. Yeah, yeah. I think also when it comes to aspects of like trying to retack these stories and portray them more as like the feminism retellings. I think there can be stuff that gets lost of like the actual characters of Greek myth, mainly characters because the characters who are mainly put in the limelight of feminism does have to deal with they are usually women who are like in power or have magic and stuff like that. And it's not to say you can't make a feminist story like that, but I can't help but notice of like, well, you're not really doing untold stories of women. You're doing stories of women who are already kind of in power to a degree.
Yeah, it's a very tricky thing to navigate because a lot of these women in these myths, you got to remember back in the day, especially in ancient Greece, women were still considered property.
Yeah, a
So
lot.
these women had an insane amount of privilege, and even to an extent, the most powerful of women, like these women who could wield magic, women who were half gods, women who were gods, they were still kind of put on a different level uh,
Mhm.
compared to the male counterparts. So it's a very tricky thing to navigate in that sense when it comes to kind of feminist retellings.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's interesting because also like characters like Medea kind of gets sidelined a lot, who is a one of the few characters who actually remarries in Greek myth, especially as a
Mm.
woman. Very, like, she's considered a very complex, kind of gray character. It's just like there aren't a ton of female characters like her, but she kind of gets overstepped to a degree because the whole kill her own kids kind of deal.
Yeah.
She's almost, I don't know, it almost comes off as like, well, she's too interesting to really do.
Yeah, there's a lot about Medea.
Yeah, I think it's also something I have kind of had an issue with when it comes. I'm not sure if this is actually the mindset people have, but kind of tackling Greek myth the way people would tackle superhero stories really frustrates me. Mainly DC and Marvel, and it's why I'm not. I kind of get it from like an abstract point of view, but I ultimately do not agree with the consensus of superheroes are modern myths. I would say superheroes are closer to like modern fables to a degree.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
because myths, you do forget myths are worshipped. They are still like and like characters like Heracles were worshipped too, even or like Dionysus, who were mortals who became gods. It's if it's like put your money where your mouth is. I want to see you sacrifice a goat to Batman. Just
I think that's another tricky one because I think it depends on who you ask, and it also depends on the culture as well. Because I do actually know, uh, I used to live with a couple of guys from India, and
mm,
they told us at one point, like when they were young, there is actually quite a big thing of being introduced to a lot of Hindu gods through comic books. So they
mm,
were kind of seen as superheroes in a sense. And I think it honestly depends on how you view it. Like in the case of Percy Jackson, it's probably a really good way of introducing kids to the mythology surrounding these gods, and it's a good way of understanding their roles in worshipping them and things like that. Uh, I think it just depends. Yeah.
yeah, that's totally fair. Oh, sorry. Yeah, just kind of go back of like another very important notes of this were characters like Wonder Woman, of course, who in the
Mm.
1940s that was huge. I want to say the 1940s. Yeah, I believe so. Of making not only this character, but also like said, kind of trying to entirely reframe Greek myth at the time. And yes, while that was very, Wonder Woman is a very important character. I feel like her comics are kind of in a weird space right now because I don't feel like her feminism has really evolved that much since the 1940s, if that makes sense. So it's just where it's very combat centered. They're very a reactionary group. It's Do you know anything about the Amazons of the original like Greek myth?
I know very little about them,
Ye-
but yeah, I know that Wonder Woman, she's not the best kind of
No.
representation of what they're about.
Yeah, it's tough because they are a very fascinating culture, and they do represent stuff like independence and like strength. But and they're similar to aspects of like the Trojan War. The Amazons were essentially they were still a warrior tribe. They worshipped the likes of Ares and Artemis, and it's that you want the cool aspect of the warrior tribe, but it's like even just like not thinking of Greek myth, what does a war culture do? Just not great stuff because that's another fascinating thing. Was like they were kind of like pirates. They raided countries, they would raid cities, they would take people as prisoner and sell them. And I get that you don't want to like show that with like your cool superhero, but it does almost like now you're in a difficult spot where you have to kind of still portray these characters, but almost like change all of a certain mythology to make them more likable.
Yeah, very sanitized version of them, very palatable, and
Yeah.
yeah, just kind of taking out all of the bits that people wouldn't be comfortable with, essentially.
Yeah. I'm not saying we need to go to the dark aspects like the some of the slavery, but it's yeah. But at the same time, I still think of stuff like God of War Ragnarok and how they portray the Norse gods. I think it's an interesting comparison because Wonder Woman does also usually portray most of the Greek gods as usually antagonists in her series, and they're fairly one note, to be honest. I did
Mm,
read several Wonder Woman comics for research, and it does feel like I don't know, just have like late '90s feminism to me, uh, but something that I think was really fascinating about the God of War portrayal of the Norse gods is that a lot of them feel like, and I think this kind of is an important aspect of a lot of myth adaptations or myth inclusions of like when you adapt like a certain mythology, if you know the lore, I feel like if you know like the actual source materials and stuff like that, it shouldn't ruin your enjoyment of the game or the series or something like that. It should make you appreciate it more because that was very interesting of like how uh, in War, in God of War Ragnarok, of how like very small details that you wouldn't think that like it's like oh that's so much cooler now because you know that of like what it's referring to and how they reinterpret it and how and they don't really portray the character so much because it highlights aspects like Odin's curiosity. It also highlights the fact Thor was a lot more human. He was also like a drunk, and he was known for his great wrath and stuff like Heimdall, like protecting borders, gets translated to being kind of uh, like almost like xenophobic.
mm.
Wonder Woman doesn't really have that. Just it's mostly just like we hate this group kind of deal.
Yeah,
I think it is. And again, I'm not saying are writers inherently obligated to do an insane amount of research for these certain aspects of mythology. I think it depends on who you ask and what they're aiming for goal wise. I think if it's, I'm a bit more open to musicals being a bit more flippant because musicals are a bit more abstract in the long run. Like Hades Town was huge, uh, and that mostly expands Hades and Persephone's inclusion of the myth. Uh, and the oh god, the new big thing is Epic the Musical, the concept album, which like took off like nothing you've seen before. Kind of crazy. Which yeah, it's kind of wild to think that someone's college project just became bigger than Wicked. Just
yeah, that's kind of crazy, isn't it?
yeah, this guy's really young too. He's only like I think he might be 27 at this point, but
Yeah, I mean, what he's made is fantastic. It's
yeah,
just, yeah,
yeah.
it's just insane to think about.
Yeah, and there are also criticisms of Epic to agree. Even criticisms I have of kind of being a bit too overly self like indulgent to the degree of like very uh I think everyone has agreed Jetpack Odysseus is very odd. Just uh, and but hey, it's a it's an interesting aspect to kind of like tackle. But I think also what's important is that misunderstandings of canonicity, sorry, uh, like misunderstandings of what is canon for like Greek and Roman myth, like it kind of like plays a bit more like I don't want to say this in like a derogatory sense, like almost like fan fiction. Would you agree?
Yeah, I'd say so. Like I said, like kind of at the beginning, I think there's a big influence of the myths and their interpretations coming from that kind of fandom culture.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and yeah, oh yeah. Speaking of, I think it's also important to note of like when we do a lot, so much of Greek myth retellings and Greek myth, there has been a recent kind of pushback, I'd say now, of kind of who gets to tell these stories. Of most of these stories have now been told by a more Western audience. Of a lot of these have like American or like influence from like the like British influence, and there is a kind of a debate of like do Greek voices kind of get lost to a degree? Because I think another issue is that a lot of people just kind of see like Greece and just Greek mythology is almost like I don't know, like it's open to it because it's like Europe to a degree. It's like well, kind of, but it's a lot like Greek like culture and like Greek history in its whole has had a very complicated history of like both expanding its territory but also like colonization stuff like that and it being also colonized to a degree.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's again, it's a bit of a weird one. I think more Greek voices should definitely be heard regarding it, and I think the bulk of the issue is that with the West, with say like American or British retellings, a lot of it is done in the name of kind of capitalizing from it. And I think that's where the problem tends to lie with a lot of it, because that influences quite a significant portion of what is adapted and how it's adapted and what specifically is written about. And I can imagine that that is a big contentious point for many people who, grew up on these myths or feel that these myths are very close to the specific identity. It's a bit of a sour subject in that regard.
Yeah. Also, I kind of want your opinion on this. Would you say some of these stories use Greek mythology because they would almost think like it wouldn't be as popular if they just made an original series?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I think that's absolutely the reason we get a lot of these retellings. Uh, People aren't going to know a specific character who kind of goes on a MacGuffin quest in order to get back to his family after spending time at war, but they would absolutely know it if his name was Odysseus, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's also interesting if like when you do compare stuff like Brother Where Art Thou, which is now it's the Odyssey to a degree.
Yeah.
Uh but I mean it just basically is that with the character even named Odysseus. But it's like yeah, he's a retelling, but there's there is a weird I don't want to come off as like kind of a prude, but like or like a bit of a snob. I think it's a better way to say that. But I don't want to come off like a snob, but like the lack of curiosity I've noticed with a lot of younger people when it comes to like older books and like older work has kind of been a bit disheartening to say of like now we have people who are like doing their own Odyssey retellings who haven't like read the Odyssey. They've only read Percy Jackson's Sea of Monsters, which is
Yeah,
I don't think the author of Percy Jackson would like that either. But uh it's yeah. Oh God, wait. Sorry, I totally lost my train of thought. Just
it's okay, but I totally agree. I think I can sort of kind of forgive that in a sense if it is mostly kids doing
yes,
that. I think the problem tends to be when it's older people who are trying to create this big franchise and trying to make a profit from it, and they have just no comprehension of the original source material. I think that therein is the biggest issue with these retail with like certain retellings.
yeah, yeah. I think yeah, it's the issue of like not people taking the myth or the culture that seriously, which is kind of tough because like in my opinion, I think the best stories that do include any mythology and stuff like that are stories that the writers are very like serious about it to a degree, and like very like
Mm.
I'm not saying like Madeline Miller is not serious about this myth. I think she is. I think she's also very knowledgeable of stuff like Achilles' like history, and I do kind of admire her points she makes. But I think she does kind of like I think mythology and like culture is a bit like second on her like list of like what's very important to her. Because I think what's mainly more important to her is ultimately kind of the romance. Just
Yeah.
where you can kind of get lost in the weeds to a degree. But yeah. Oh yeah. Also, I think another thing I meant to bring this up earlier, but like, did you hear of when Christopher Nolan's Odyssey was announced? Did you hear like the very large trend of people who had no idea what the Odyssey was?
Yeah, I did hear quite a few whispers of that. I think my
Which
partner in particular was like, "What the hell?"
is very frustrating. It's like it's also just I don't know. It's just I don't consider myself like a huge like I don't consider myself like Mr. History, but like it is also a thing where it's just like there's so many books that are like just so like universal to a degree, and the Odyssey is a very universal adventure story. That's it's weird just to hear people kind of like publicly like kind of admit that they had no interest whatsoever, or like it wasn't even like required reading at any points, which just it's wow. Uh, but just yeah. And now I think another kind of weird issue of kind of the opposite side of what we've kind of been previously talking about is aspects of like kind of the need to also just like remove all the fantastical or just like even just flashy elements from like a lot of these stories of like Christopher the leaks we've seen of like Christopher Nolan's new Odyssey. Have you heard of the controversy with that?
No, I don't think I have.
Well, he has very plain black armor and like very standard quill, like very standard just plating, like no detail. The issue is that like in the Iliad, the most like described aspects of these of these kings and stuff like that were mainly their armor, like how much it's kind of like put into their character and stuff like that. Like Odysseus had very infamously he had the bone tusk helmet and the bone tusk armor,
Mm.
which is it's armor that's like embroidered with like boar tusk and stuff like that, and to show off like both his history as a king, but also like his history of the boar. And I don't know, it feels like because this is also important to mention of like there is a certain amount group of like dudes out there who try to use stuff like aspects of like Greek mythology or Norse mythology. It's like kind of a supremacist kind of thing,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
which is that's very important to talk about because a lot of it does also erase a lot of stuff like a lot of the important like queer relationships, but also a lot of the very important relationships that like women had in those stories. And it's not to say that Greek society was not patriarchal. It was, but it was also like it's one of those things where it's just like you forget the level of nuance that was there in comparison.
Yeah. It's yeah. The issue with a lot of patriarchal and supremacist issues is that they tend to also strip away a lot of aspects that they deem to be kind of too effeminate, not strong enough. Like, for example, the armors. Uh, I don't know, for some reason, decorating things seems to be too effeminate of a thing now, and it's really weird.
Yeah. Oh god, that was yeah. That was another big issue. Did you ever the restoration of like certain Greek statues in by British what's the right term? Archaeologists, I believe. But like, did you hear with that of like how a lot of when a lot of like Greek like statues and like other aspects like that were brought over to the UK, a lot of British like scholars said like no, it has to be like white, it has to be like plain. There's no color. When a lot of people agreed, no, these statues were colored.
Yeah, that sounds like what we'd do. But yeah, I think I do remember that.
Yeah, yeah, that's another thing. Like, yeah, people have always been people, and people also just like color to a degree. People like flashy elements.
Yeah, like it was the whole aspect of like the culture, you know? Like if you actually look at areas in Greece, like yes, you have a lot of the white buildings, but there is also other places that are absolutely filled with color. And of course that would extend to like ancient times and the statues. Why wouldn't it?
Mhm. Yeah, another thing is that it's just like, yeah, a lot of these like statues were colored, and a lot of it just kind of like wore off to a degree.
Yeah. It just came off over time, like, you know.
Mhm. But uh, yeah, I think kind of to wrap this up, maybe kind of discuss of like what some of our more preferred Greek myth retellings or like way to tackle mythology in a retelling would be.
Mm.
Uh, where I think a great, again, we have kind of talked a bit down towards it before. No, well, I have a lot, but I do genuinely think that Percy Jackson is a great way to introduce it to kids and uh, get them interested into, you know, maybe more so the concept of Greek mythology. It's a great jumping off board because like those books were like for middle schoolers, I believe. Uh, but also, I think it has an odd amount of nuance that I feel like kind of a lot of older books kind of lack now. Books for adults, I'd say now lack when it comes to the Greek myth retellings, which I find to be a bit shocking.
Yeah, I get you with that.
But yeah, just it's that and the other recent I do, again, I do, there are complete criticisms you can have of the, of the series, but I do really like Epic the musical, because ultimately, like, yes, this is also a concept album, but also the music slaps. It just
Yeah, and plus because it's still just the music, they do have opportunities within if they do go ahead with the whole musical, they can fill in the gaps.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah. Is there a Greek myth retelling you would really recommend, or something you would think is almost like the, or even just a myth retelling of like the way you would kind of idealize, like you think should be the basis that like other authors should kind of aspire to?
Hmm. I don't know if aspire to is the correct term because I don't think I think there is room for interpretation with these things. Even though I agree that it is important to know the source material and understand the culture that you are referencing from and all of that. Things like this, I don't think they're terrible and they are enjoyable for a reason and people like them for a reason.
Of course.
But if I had to pick one that I'm really interested in at the minute and I'm dying to get it when it finally releases is probably Hades, like Hades 2, especially the
Oh
game.
yeah, God, the game has looked just so gorgeous. Everything I've seen from Hades 2 so far.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, there are so many things with that that, like,
Yeah,
you know, is
yeah,
definitely not concurrent with the actual myths, but
yeah.
I enjoy it. I like watching it. I watch a lot of speed runs of it when I'm drawing, and I just find it really enjoyable.
Yeah, yeah, it does soften up. Yeah, Achilles has had a weird boom recently. Just I'm on create like almost like a tier list when it comes to like the characters who have in Greek mythology that have like have had like almost been like retconned by Tumblr to a degree of like Achilles, Hades, Ares, Medusa. But yeah, no, that game just, I think another thing is it's important that like with that game itself, it is definitely a bit like, I think it's even that game is a bit more playful with how it reinterprets Law of Gods as well.
Yeah, I think it also helps that the main characters are kind of minor gods that we don't know much about, so they are kind
Right.
of like a sandbox in a sense, like Zagreus and Melenoi.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, and it's also just like they're also a bit more vague about the history of certain Greek myth elements,
Yeah.
but yeah, thank you so much for coming on. Fiona, would you like to tell people where they can find you?
Yeah, of course. So my main social medias are obviously YouTube at Fionapollo. I'm most active on Blue Sky outside of that. Fiona Apollo again. I have an Instagram, fionapollo.yt. And yeah, those tend to be the three that I frequent the most. So if you're interested in what I do a lot of animations, I do a lot of art, talk about pop culture and all of that. Yeah, that's where you can find me.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you later next time. Bye.